The world held its breath. In a region where one wrong move can send shockwaves across every economy on the planet, a fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran now stands as the only barrier between uneasy calm and full-scale catastrophe. But tonight, that barrier is cracking. Welcome. What you are about to hear is not a war story. Not yet. But it may become one. Because right now, in the narrow blue waters of the Strait of Hormuz, the fate of the global oil market, and possibly the world economy, hangs by the thinnest of threads. Let's start with the basics, because the geography alone tells you everything you need to know about why this moment matters so much. The Strait of Hormuz is a waterway barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. That is smaller than many cities. And yet, through that tiny corridor, roughly 20% of all the world's oil supply passes every single day. Every tanker, every barrel, every drop of energy that heats homes in Europe, powers factories in Asia, and fuels vehicles across the Americas, a massive portion of it flows through that one narrow channel. Now imagine someone threatening to close it. That is exactly where we are tonight. Iran has, in recent days, moved additional naval assets into the Persian Gulf. Revolutionary Guard vessels have been spotted conducting what Iranian state media is calling routine exercises. But military analysts watching the satellite imagery are not calling it routine. They are calling it a show of force, a message, and that message is directed squarely at Washington. So how did we get here? To understand this crisis, you have to go back. Not weeks, not months, years. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been defined by hostility, mistrust, and occasional moments of near war for decades. Since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, the two nations have never fully stepped back from the edge. They have come close, but they have never stepped back. The 2015 nuclear deal, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was supposed to change that. Iran agreed to scale back its nuclear program. In return, crippling economic sanctions would be lifted. For a brief window, it seemed like diplomacy might actually work. Then came the withdrawal. In 2018, the United States pulled out of that agreement unilaterally. Maximum pressure sanctions were reimposed. Iran's economy was strangled. Oil exports collapsed. The Iranian rial lost most of its value almost overnight. And the hardliners inside Tehran, the ones who had always argued that America could never be trusted, suddenly had all the evidence they needed. From that point forward, the escalation became almost rhythmic. Iranian-backed militias attacked U.S. positions in Iraq. American drones struck Iranian proxy commanders. The two countries exchanged blows through proxies, through cyber attacks, through economic warfare. And through it all, the Strait of Hormuz was always the unspoken wild card, the ultimate leverage Iran held over the entire Western world. Now, that wild card is being played. The ceasefire that is now under intense stress was brokered less than 3 months ago under considerable international pressure. It came after a particularly dangerous exchange, one that brought U.S. and Iranian forces closer to direct kinetic conflict than they had been in years. The details of exactly what happened in those 72 hours are still partially classified. But what is known is that the situation escalated rapidly. Back-channel communications were opened through Omani intermediaries, and both sides agreed, reluctantly, to pull back. The agreement was described at the time as a de-escalation framework, not a peace deal, not a normalization. A framework, meaning both sides agreed, in principle, to stop making things worse while diplomatic discussions continued. But diplomacy is only as strong as the political will behind it. And right now, that political will is evaporating on both sides. Inside Iran, the ceasefire has been deeply unpopular with hardline factions inside the government and, critically, within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. These are the people who control Iran's military posture in the Gulf. They are not elected officials. They are not diplomats. They are ideological soldiers who have spent their entire careers viewing the United States as an existential enemy. And they see the ceasefire not as a diplomatic victory, but as a humiliation. Sources familiar with the internal Iranian political situation describe growing tension between the moderate factions who negotiated the ceasefire and the hardline military establishment that answers ultimately to the supreme leader. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has been conspicuously silent about the ceasefire in recent weeks. That silence is being read in different ways by different analysts. But the most alarming interpretation, the one gaining traction among intelligence officials, is that it signals a withdrawal of support, that the supreme leader may be allowing the hardliners to maneuver. If that interpretation is correct, then the ceasefire is not just fragile. It may already be functionally dead. On the American side, the political dynamics are equally complicated. The current administration faces pressure from multiple directions. Allies in Europe and Asia are desperate for the ceasefire to hold because their economies are the most immediately vulnerable to any disruption of Gulf oil flows. But domestic political forces are pushing in a very different direction. There are voices in Washington arguing that any engagement with Iran, any diplomatic accommodation, is a sign of weakness, that the only language Tehran understands is force. This is the political tightrope that American policymakers are currently walking, and the rope is fraying. Now let's talk about what a Hormuz closure, or even a serious disruption, would actually mean for global oil markets. Because this is where the stakes become visceral and immediate for ordinary people around the world. Approximately 17 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself all export through this corridor. If that flow is disrupted, even partially, the impact on global oil prices would be immediate and severe. Market analysts who have modeled this scenario suggest that even a partial closure, one that reduces flow by 30 to 40%, could push oil prices to $150 per barrel or higher within weeks. Some more aggressive models suggest $200 per barrel is not out of the question in a sustained closure scenario. To put that in terms ordinary people can feel, gasoline prices in the United States, which have already been volatile, could spike to levels not seen since the worst energy crises of the past century. In Europe, where energy dependence on Gulf imports is structurally higher, the impact could be even more severe. Economies that are already navigating slow growth and elevated inflation could be tipped into recession. And in developing nations, countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa that have little economic buffer, the consequences could be catastrophic. Food supply chains depend on fuel. Transportation depends on fuel. Electricity generation in many developing economies depends on fuel. A sustained oil shock of this magnitude would not be an economic inconvenience. It would be a humanitarian crisis. This is why the Strait of Hormuz is sometimes called the world's most critical choke point, not just for oil, for civilization as we have organized it. And Iran knows this. This is not an accident of geography. Iranian strategic doctrine has incorporated the Hormuz threat for decades. The IRGC's naval forces have spent years developing the capacity to lay mines, to deploy fast attack boats, and to threaten tanker traffic in ways that would be extremely difficult for even a superior naval force to fully neutralize quickly. American military planners have gamed out Hormuz scenarios extensively, and the honest conclusion that those war games consistently produce is deeply uncomfortable. There is no clean, surgical solution. Any military action to reopen the strait would be costly, time-consuming, and unpredictable in its escalatory consequences. Iran's leadership knows this too. That is what makes the threat credible. And credible threats change behavior, including the behavior of markets. In the past 72 hours, oil futures markets have already begun to move. Brent crude has risen by more than 8% in the past week alone, largely driven by risk premium, the market pricing in the possibility that supply could be disrupted. Shipping insurance rates for tankers transiting the Gulf have jumped sharply. Several major shipping companies have quietly begun reviewing their Gulf routing procedures, asking exactly the question that nobody wants to have to answer. At what point does it become safer and cheaper to reroute around Africa rather than pass through a potential conflict zone? That question, by itself, tells you how serious the situation has become. Let's turn now to the broader geopolitical picture. Because this crisis does not exist in a vacuum. It is happening at a moment of extraordinary global complexity, and the decisions made in the coming weeks will reverberate far beyond the Persian Gulf. Russia is watching this situation with considerable interest. Moscow has a deeply complicated relationship with Tehran. They are neither full allies nor opponents. But Russia is an oil exporter, and a significant Hormuz disruption that drives global oil prices sharply higher would be, in purely economic terms, a windfall for the Russian state budget. Western analysts are watching carefully for any signs that Russian actors might be quietly encouraging Iranian hardliners. That may sound conspiratorial, but in the current geopolitical environment, these kinds of overlapping interests are simply reality. China is watching with even more acute concern, but for opposite reasons. China is the world's largest importer of Gulf oil. Any serious disruption to Hormuz oil flows hits China harder than almost any other major economy. Beijing has been notably active in back-channel diplomacy in recent weeks, pressing both Washington and Tehran to preserve the ceasefire. China brokered a Saudi-Iran diplomatic rapprochement just a few years ago, and that deal gave Beijing significant diplomatic credibility in the region. They do not want to see that credibility evaporate in a new Gulf crisis. Chinese diplomatic sources have been making quiet but urgent interventions. Whether those interventions carry enough weight to matter remains to be seen. Israel is also a critical variable in this equation. The Israeli government has been deeply skeptical of any diplomatic accommodation with Iran since the beginning. Israeli intelligence services have consistently assessed Iran's nuclear program as the primary existential threat facing the state of Israel. Any agreement that reduces pressure on Tehran is viewed in Jerusalem as a strategic setback, and if the ceasefire collapses, if the United States finds itself in a direct confrontation with Iran, Israel's calculus about its own potential military options changes dramatically. This is the interconnected web of interests and risks that surrounds the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. No single actor controls the outcome. Every player has a different set of interests and red lines, and the margin for miscalculation is extraordinarily thin. Let's talk about the specific flashpoints, the concrete scenarios that could tip this situation from a tense standoff into open conflict. The first scenario involves a tanker incident. This has happened before. In 2019, a series of tanker attacks in the Gulf of Oman, attacks that the United States attributed to Iran and which Iran denied, very nearly produced a military confrontation. In the current environment, another tanker incident, whether deliberate, accidental, or staged, could trigger an escalatory spiral that neither side intends, but neither side can stop. The second scenario involves miscalculation at sea. When you have American naval vessels and Iranian Revolutionary Guard fast boats operating in close proximity in a high-tension environment, the risk of an incident that neither side planned is very real. A misread signal, a communications failure, a junior officer making a split-second decision. These are not hypothetical risks. They are documented features of every previous near crisis in the Gulf. The third scenario, and arguably the most dangerous, involves the nuclear dimension. Iran's nuclear program has continued to advance during this period of ceasefire. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency have reported uranium enrichment at levels that are technically below weapons grade, but uncomfortably close to it. If Iranian enrichment activity accelerates, or if intelligence suggests Iran is moving toward weaponization, American and Israeli pressure for a military strike on Iranian nuclear facilities could become overwhelming, regardless of any ceasefire framework. That scenario, a strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure, would almost certainly produce an immediate Iranian response targeting Gulf oil infrastructure and the strait itself. The consequences of that chain of events are almost impossible to fully model. But the word that keeps appearing in the classified assessments, according to officials who have read them, is the word catastrophic. Now, let's consider the diplomatic paths forward. Because crisis, even severe crisis, does not always end in war. History shows us that even the most dangerous standoffs can be resolved when the right combination of pressure, incentive, and leadership comes together. The most realistic de-escalation pathway involves a renegotiated agreement that gives both sides something they can present as a win domestically. For Iran, that almost certainly means sanctions relief. Real, meaningful, verifiable relief that allows the Iranian economy to recover and gives moderate political forces something to show the Iranian public. For the United States, it likely means concrete, verifiable constraints on Iran's nuclear program and some form of limitation on the most provocative IRGC naval activities in the Gulf. The problem is that the trust deficit between these two governments is so profound that even agreeing on a framework for negotiations is enormously difficult. Every Iranian diplomatic concession is viewed through the lens of 2018. The memory of an agreement being torn up unilaterally is not abstract for Iranian policymakers. It is the defining trauma of their recent diplomatic history. And every American accommodation toward Iran is viewed by skeptics in Washington as appeasement of a regime that has consistently acted in bad faith. Bridging that trust deficit requires, at minimum, a sustained commitment from both leaderships to the process. That commitment does not currently exist in any visible or credible form. The Omani Channel, which has historically served as the most reliable back-channel between Washington and Tehran, is reportedly still open. Qatari intermediaries have also been active, and United Nations Secretary General has called publicly for an emergency diplomatic initiative. But calls for diplomacy, without the underlying political conditions to support them, tend to produce press releases rather than agreements. The wild card in all of this is the Iranian public. Iran is not a monolith. Inside the country, there is enormous frustration with economic conditions that have been grinding the population down for years. Ordinary Iranians are not ideological actors. They are people trying to live their lives in an economy that sanctions and mismanagement have severely damaged. Public polling, to the extent it can be conducted reliably in Iran, consistently shows that most Iranians want economic normalization and engagement with the outside world, not military confrontation. But that public sentiment, as powerful as it is in a historical sense, does not translate easily into political power within the Iranian system. The institutions that make military and security decisions are not accountable to public opinion in the way that democratic governments are. The Revolutionary Guard does not answer to Iranian voters. It answers to a different chain of authority entirely. And that is perhaps the deepest structural problem with this crisis. The people making the decisions that could trigger war are not the people who would suffer most from its consequences. Let's look at what the United States military posture currently looks like in the region, because that posture itself is a significant factor in how this situation develops. American naval assets in and around the Gulf have been reinforced in recent weeks. Additional destroyers have moved into position. The presence of carrier strike groups in the region has been adjusted to account for the elevated threat environment. American military officials have been careful in their public statements, avoiding any language that could be read as threatening or escalatory, while simultaneously making clear through their positioning that they are not going to be caught unprepared. This is the challenge of deterrence in a high-tension environment. You need to demonstrate enough capability and resolve to convince the other side that aggression would be costly. But you cannot be so aggressive in your posture that you provoke the very incident you are trying to prevent. It is an inherently unstable equilibrium, and maintaining it requires extraordinary judgment and discipline at every level of the chain of command. One of the most underappreciated aspects of this crisis is the role of economic actors. The oil companies, the shipping companies, the insurance markets, the commodity traders, whose decisions in aggregate can significantly shape the political environment. Markets are not passive observers of geopolitical crisis. They are active participants. When shipping companies start rerouting away from the Gulf, that increases costs and creates pressure. When oil prices spike, that creates political pressure in consumer nations. When insurance rates make certain routes economically unviable, that changes the physical reality of how energy moves around the world. We are already seeing early signs of these market mechanisms beginning to operate. The question is whether they develop quickly enough and powerfully enough to create the political conditions for a diplomatic resolution, or whether they instead accelerate the crisis by adding economic pressure to an already stressed geopolitical situation. History offers both possibilities. The 1973 oil embargo created enormous economic pain, but it also eventually produced diplomatic movement. The late 1980s tanker war in the Gulf, when Iran and Iraq both attacked oil shipping during their brutal 8-year conflict, was ultimately brought under control, though not before significant damage was done. The pattern of Gulf crises in modern history is one of extreme tension followed by resolution, but also one of genuine close calls, moments when the situation could have gone very differently. We cannot assume that pattern will hold indefinitely. There is a concept in international relations theory called the security dilemma. It describes a situation in which the defensive actions taken by one side to increase its own security are perceived by the other side as threatening and trigger a response that makes everyone less secure. The Persian Gulf right now is a textbook security dilemma. Every move that the United States makes to reassure its allies and deter Iranian aggression is read in Tehran as evidence of American hostility. Every move Iran makes to demonstrate its military capability and resolve is read in Washington and among Gulf Arab states as evidence of Iranian aggression. Both sides are acting in their own frameworks defensively, and yet the aggregate effect of those defensive actions is to bring everyone closer to war. Breaking a security dilemma requires one of two things: either a genuine, verifiable reduction in the threat environment that allows both sides to stand down simultaneously, or a crisis severe enough to shock both sides into recognizing that the alternative to compromise is catastrophe. Neither of those conditions currently exists. The threat environment is not reducing, and the crisis has not yet reached the threshold of shock that produces genuine political will for change. That middle ground, more dangerous than peace, less definitive than war, is exactly where the world finds itself tonight. What are the economic alternatives if the worst happens? If the strait is closed, fully or partially, what levers does the rest of the world have? The first response would be the activation of strategic petroleum reserves. The United States, in coordination with the International Energy Agency, has the capability to release hundreds of millions of barrels of emergency oil onto the market. That capacity is real and it matters, but it is not unlimited. Strategic reserves are a bridge, a tool for buying time, not a permanent solution to a sustained disruption. Saudi Arabia has significant spare production capacity. If Riyadh chose to maximize output to offset Hormuz disruption, it could add meaningful supply. But Saudi Arabia's own oil exports pass through Hormuz. In a severe disruption scenario, Saudi Arabia is simultaneously a potential solution and a fellow victim. Alternative transit routes exist but have significant limitations. The East-West pipeline across Saudi Arabia can move oil to Red Sea terminals, bypassing the Gulf. But its capacity is a fraction of total Hormuz flow. The Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline has similar limitations. The painful truth is that there is no rapid, scalable alternative to the Strait of Hormuz. It is irreplaceable in any short to medium time frame. This is the central geopolitical reality that makes this crisis so acute. There is no good alternative. There is no easy workaround. The world built its energy infrastructure around the assumption that Hormuz would remain open. And for decades, even through significant regional conflict, it has. But that assumption cannot be taken for granted forever. Let's talk about where this goes from here. Because crisis, by its nature, resolves one way or another. Stasis is not a stable condition. Something will change. The next several weeks are critical. Diplomatic contacts are reportedly continuing through multiple channels. There are quiet conversations happening at a level below public visibility that could, if the conditions are right, produce a framework for renewed negotiations. People in the business of preventing wars, and there are dedicated professionals on all sides working toward that goal, are working intensely. But the pressure on the ceasefire is building, not easing. The military posturing in the Gulf is escalating, not de-escalating. The political dynamics inside Iran and inside Washington are not moving toward compromise. They are moving away from it. If a triggering incident occurs, a tanker attack, a naval confrontation, an intelligence revelation about the nuclear program, the speed with which this situation could escalate from crisis to conflict is alarming. Modern crises move faster than the diplomatic mechanisms designed to manage them. This is a lesson the world has learned before, sometimes at terrible cost. The generation that lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 understood viscerally how quickly a nuclear standoff could emerge from a chain of decisions that nobody, individually, intended to produce war. What pulled the world back from the brink in that moment was a combination of extraordinary leadership, back-channel communication, and, it must be said, luck. The world got lucky in 1962. It cannot count on luck forever. The Strait of Hormuz crisis of today is not equivalent to the Cuban Missile Crisis in its nuclear dimensions, but in its potential for economic devastation, in its capacity to trigger a chain of escalation that spirals beyond anyone's control, and in the yawning gap between the gravity of the stakes and the inadequacy of the political will to address them, the parallels are more than metaphorical. What history teaches us, above all, is that crises at this level are never fully under anyone's control. Leaders make decisions based on incomplete information, under enormous pressure, with political constraints that limit their options. Intelligence assessments are wrong. Signals are misread. Red lines that seemed clear become ambiguous in the moment of crisis. The gap between what leaders intend and what actually happens is where wars begin. The world is watching the Strait of Hormuz tonight with a combination of alarm and, in many quarters, a troubling degree of normalcy. Because we have been here before, not exactly here but close enough, and the crisis has always resolved without catastrophe. That pattern breeds a certain complacency, a sense that it will work out because it always works out. That complacency may be the most dangerous element of all. The ceasefire holds. For now. The ships are still moving through the strait. The oil is still flowing. Markets are rattled but not broken. Diplomats are talking, even if the talks are slow and frustrating and unlikely to produce a breakthrough in the near term. But the margin for error has never been smaller. The trust between these two governments has never been lower. The political dynamics on both sides have never been less hospitable to the kind of bold, courageous leadership that genuine de-escalation requires. And the consequences of failure, for oil markets, for global economies, for the millions of ordinary people whose lives would be upended by an energy shock of historic proportions, have never been higher. This is not a story with a clear ending. Not tonight. The next chapter will be written in the decisions made, and the mistakes avoided, in the days and weeks ahead. In the conversations happening right now in back-channel diplomatic settings, in the judgment calls being made by naval commanders in the Persian Gulf, in the political calculations of leaders in Tehran, Washington, Riyadh, Beijing, and Jerusalem. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide, but tonight it feels like the narrowest place on Earth. This has been a documentary analysis of one of the most consequential geopolitical crises of our time. The situation continues to develop. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. Because what happens in those 21 miles of water does not stay there. It comes home. To every economy. Every household. Every person who relies on a world order held together by the fragile assumption that the oil will keep flowing. That assumption is being tested right now, and the outcome is not guaranteed.